Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever and whenever you may be. Welcome all to our introduction to FDA's Office of Trade and Global Partnerships webinar. My name is Lieutenant Commander Nora Lim, and I am with the Small Business and Industry Assistance, or SBIA, program, which operates within the Division of Drug Information, which in turn resides in FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Office of Communications. And I will be your host for today's session. Before we begin, note we encourage you to connect with us. For your convenience, we've included QR codes to access SBIA on LinkedIn, X, YouTube, and via email updates. Scan the QR code with the camera on your cell phone. This will provide you with a link to SBIA on the platform for the code that you scanned. It's great to stay connected with SBIA social media platforms to learn about upcoming webinars, conferences, and regulatory information, and also to find recordings of past webinars and conferences. Now, let's turn our attention to some logistics. Please note this event is 100% remote in addition to being 100% virtual. Our speakers and panelists, not to mention our SBIA team and technical staff, are in separate locations. As such, there may be some internet issues, but please bear with us, and if in fact we do encounter those, we will try to get them resolved as quickly as possible. Speaking of tech issues, here's our link for our one-stop shop for answers to your technical questions, for downloading files, accessing the survey link to obtain the certificate of attendance, and so much more. That's the same page that you used today for your online access to the event, so please bookmark that page. If you have any technical questions about this webinar, please check there first and you will most likely find the answer. We also invite you to submit your questions to us so that we have a vibrant and productive Q&A segment, which is so crucial to these events. This is a learning opportunity, and we encourage you to take full advantage of the expertise offered here. When you do submit your question, please identify the individual presenter by prefacing your question with the speaker's name as shown here, for example, @Joseph. Please keep in mind that while we may not get to your individual question, some of these sessions can literally have over 100 questions. The questions are always very helpful as we plan for future events. Also note the final survey is the mechanism by which you will receive the certificate of attendance, which will support continuing education or CE credits for RAPS, SOCRA, SQA, and ACRP. When an attendee completes the survey/evaluation, they can then download a certificate, which may be used in support of these CE credits. The certificate must be downloaded immediately after completing the survey, otherwise the opportunity is lost. Even if you do not want or need a certificate, please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation, as your feedback will help guide the design of our future events. Note that the evaluation and certificate are only available for 2 weeks, which means that the deadline date for this event is August 6th. Now, we'll take a moment to call your attention to some of our upcoming events. We also invite you to visit our Cedar Learn webpage, where you can find links to SBIA tutorials along with other educational resources, many of which also offer CEs. And again, that website is fda.gov Cedar Learn. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. First, we'll hear from Joseph Rieras, Director of the Office of Trade and Global Partnerships, that's located within the Office of Global Policy and Strategy within the Office of the Commissioner here at FDA. Then we will have a presentation by Eloisa Noriega, an international policy analyst, as well as Azada Hafiz, also an international policy analyst, followed by presentations by Kristen Callahan, Senior Public Health Advisor, and Matthew Scherer, International Policy Analyst, all within the Office of Trade and Global Partnerships. Now, please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Joseph Rieras.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you to SBIA for organizing this webinar and to all of you attending today. To start off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Joseph Rieras, and I'm the Director of FDA's Office of Trade and Global Partnerships, or OTGP. The goal of our presentation today is to provide you with an overview of the work OTGP does and how it impacts drug products. We hope it gives you a greater awareness of the issues we cover, why those issues are important, and how OTGP can serve as a resource. Let me first explain where our office is located within the FDA. We are part of the Office of the Commissioner's Office of Policy, Legislation, and International Affairs, or OPLEA, a constellation of offices and staff led by a deputy commissioner. OPLEA's expertise is in policy, economic analysis, legislation, and international and intergovernmental affairs, which it uses to develop and advance policies that protect and promote the public health. Within OPLEA is the Office of Global Policy and Strategy, or OGPS. OGPS is comprised of three offices: the Office of Communications, Evaluation, and Logistics, the Office of Global Operations, which includes the FDA's foreign offices, and the Office of Trade and Global Partnerships, which we will be discussing in depth today. So, what does OTGP do? OTGP serves as the FDA lead on addressing issues related to international trade of regulated products, including pharmaceutical products, negotiating mutual recognition agreements related to good manufacturing practices of drug products, and entering into international arrangements and sharing information with global counterparts. OTGP also serves as the FDA lead for addressing cross-cutting issues in multilateral organizations, such as the World Health Organization. And I do want to highlight that on all of these issues, we work very closely with the FDA product centers, as well as our partners throughout the federal government. Now, you can probably see right away the breadth of topics we cover, and you may be asking yourself, well, what does this mean for me? The answer to that certainly depends on your individual context, but I will say that broadly, our work involves strengthening partnerships and information sharing to create efficiencies and bolster our regulatory oversight of medical product supply chains, as well as addressing issues that might create unnecessary barriers to trade or could have unintended consequences for our regulation of medical products. Regardless of whether you are a part of industry, with a trade association, or with the patient advocacy group, or are a researcher or practitioner, you are likely to see the benefit of this work and how it improves access for patients. To give an example on how our work bolsters regulatory oversight, consider the FDA's 3 mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs, in force with the European Union, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. These MRAs recognize that these foreign regulatory authorities are capable of conducting inspections that meet U.S. requirements and allow FDA to recognize drug inspections conducted by these foreign regulatory authorities. MRAs help the FDA and its partners avoid duplication of inspections, lower inspection costs, and enable regulators to devote more resources to other parts of the world. We'll discuss MRAs in detail later, as well as other types of arrangements and agreements. On the trade side, I know that trade policy doesn't necessarily come to mind when thinking about the FDA, but in fact, there are 2 reasons why the FDA follows trade policy closely. 1, to protect our regulations and authorities, and 2, to use trade initiatives as a vehicle to advance public health. In cooperation and coordination with regulatory agencies, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, is responsible for monitoring U.S. compliance with U.S. trade obligations, including at the World Trade Organization, which operates the global system of trade rules between nations. Our office, OTGP, represents FDA as part of the U.S. delegations to WTO committee meetings and trade negotiations. As you'll see later in the presentation, trade issues are relevant in a variety of scenarios related to drug products. Right now, OTGP is actively managing the FDA's participation in several major international negotiations simultaneously. One of those is the ongoing work to develop a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution under the auspices of the United Nations. Again, why would the FDA be involved here? Well, for many FDA-regulated products, plastic can be important to ensure safety and efficacy. For example, plastic is a frequently used material in pharmaceutical container closure systems, and there's also plastic used in many drug and vaccine delivery devices. So, OTGP is involved in these negotiations to ensure that FDA's regulatory interests are taken into account during the negotiations. Another example is the World Health Organization negotiations to amend the international health regulations. These regulations cover measures for preventing the transnational spread of diseases. Because FDA regulates medical products used in responding to outbreak events, FDA has an interest in these negotiations. I hope that sets the stage for what we'll discuss today. I'll hand it over to 4 of our experts who will go into more details about these topics. We'll start off with Eloisa Noriega, who will cover mutual recognition agreements between FDA and foreign drug regulatory authorities. Over to you, Eloisa.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you again, SBIA, and all of you in attendance today. As Joseph mentioned, my name is Eloisa Noriega, and I'm an international policy analyst within FDA's Office of Trade and Global Partnerships. Today, I hope to provide a brief overview and introduction into mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs, specifically FDA's MRAs with foreign drug regulatory authorities. So, what are MRAs? Mutual recognition agreements are agreements between 2 or more countries to recognize a specific process or procedure of the other country's regulatory authority. Under the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, enacted in 2012, FDA has the authority to enter into agreements to recognize drug inspections conducted by foreign regulatory authorities if FDA determined those authorities are capable of conducting inspections that meet U.S. requirements. I will dive in a little more into how FDA defines capable later on in my presentation. The primary objectives of MRAs are to enhance regulatory efficiency, avoid duplication of inspections, and enable reallocation of regulatory resources towards inspections of drug manufacturing facilities with potentially higher public health risks across the globe. Before the first MRA went into force in 2017, some of the same facilities were inspected in the same year by EU and FDA investigators, even if the facilities had a strong record of compliance. The COVID pandemic underscored the need for global partnerships such as MRAs, when travel restrictions further hindered regulatory authorities' ability to monitor manufacturing operations, especially overseas. By leveraging partnerships and advancing mutual recognition agreements with regulatory authorities who are capable of conducting inspections that meet U.S. requirements, FDA is better equipped to maintain and expand its oversight of the drug supply chain and minimize the risk of shortages. FDA's approach to MRAs involves engaging in dialogue with foreign regulatory authorities to establish mutual recognition frameworks. FDA has previously negotiated and successfully implemented 3 MRAs. The 3 MRAs in force are with the European Union, United Kingdom, and Switzerland. The FDA has developed a standardized process for determining the capability of regulatory authorities. The assessment is comprehensive and requires the collaboration of numerous centers and offices within the FDA. A capable regulatory authority must tick the following boxes: has a legal and regulatory authority to conduct inspections against a standard for good manufacturing practice, manages conflicts of interest in an ethical manner, evaluates risks and mitigates them, maintains appropriate oversight of manufacturing facilities within its territory, receives adequate resources and uses them, employs trained and qualified inspectors with the skills and knowledge to identify manufacturing practices that may lead to patient harm, possesses the tools necessary to take action to protect the public from harm due to poor quality drugs or medicinal products. Keep in mind that capable does not require that the regulatory authority maintain procedures for conducting inspections and overseeing manufacturing facilities that are identical to the FDA's procedures. Both countries conduct capability assessments of each other to determine capability. The EU, UK, and Switzerland found FDA capable after conducting their capability assessments. FDA found all 3 partners to be capable as well. FDA and the EU expanded the scope of their MRA to include animal drugs, and FDA is working on the capability assessments for EU veterinary authorities. I think it's also important to mention that both the FDA and the MRA partner reserve the right to inspect at any time and in any country. However, surveillance inspections are expected to be the exception rather than the rule. Also, if an MRA partner takes an enforcement action against a facility after conducting an inspection, FDA does not have to take the same action. The FDA and its MRA partners will individually rely upon the facts obtained from an inspection. Although the impact of different enforcement actions is similar, The FDA and our MRA partners have different legal systems and enforcement tools and can take different enforcement actions. There are some products that are excluded from the MRAs, such as advanced therapy medicinal products, ATMPs, human blood, human plasma, human tissues and organs, and veterinary immunologicals. Since we want you to learn more about our office, I will provide some insight into our role. Our office is involved in many of the different aspects of the MRA process, from partner identification to implementation. Some of our responsibilities include serving as a primary point of contact with U.S. interagency counterparts and foreign government entities to facilitate negotiations and finalize agreement terms. Ensuring appropriate information exchange arrangements regarding sharing non-public information are in place, and that the timing supports initial assessment and implementation activities. Leading liaison activities and communications with foreign regulatory authority on initial assessment timelines. Leading a collaborative effort with other FDA centers and offices to plan and facilitate initial capability assessments of potential MRA partners. Establishing and maintaining procedures to ensure MRA implementation and maintenance are consistently applied across FDA and across agreements. Our office, along with many others within FDA, play a vital role in our MRA's success. That concludes my presentation. Here are some links that can provide more information. Now that you have learned about MRAs, I will hand it over to Azada, who will speak to you about the impact of FDA's international arrangements on pharmaceutical products. Thank you, Azada, and thank you all for your time.
Hello, my name is Azada Hafiz, and today I will provide an overview of FDA's international arrangement portfolio and how that impacts pharmaceutical products. The FDA faces ever greater challenges in fulfilling our complex public health responsibilities. In today's world, imports account for a significant percentage of pharmaceuticals that U.S. consumers and patients use in their daily life. Determining whether a product has been properly manufactured, distributed, and stored, and who has handled the product has become increasingly difficult amid these complex transnational supply chains. It requires the collection, analysis, and dissemination of high-quality information that can't come from FDA staff alone. The FDA works with a variety of foreign government counterparts and international organizations to foster not only the development and safety, but also the availability of pharmaceuticals. The FDA addresses these gaps through international partnerships with foreign government counterparts and international organizations. The tools that FDA uses to set up and memorialize these partnerships include cooperative arrangements, which are non-binding, as well as disclosure arrangements, which FDA refers to as confidentiality commitments. Cooperative arrangements are a written understanding that FDA can establish with one or more foreign government counterpart or international organization that describes the willingness and good faith intentions of FDA and its counterpart to engage in cooperative and regulatory activities. But even with a cooperative arrangement in place, the FDA cannot share non-public information unless a confidentiality commitment is in place. Confidentiality commitments permit FDA to disclose non-public information while adhering to FDA's disclosure laws and regulations. A confidentiality commitment must be in place for FDA to share non-public information. Cooperative arrangements are an important tool for establishing or strengthening international relations. They facilitate cooperation with foreign counterparts by permitting counterparts to cooperate with FDA and are useful for maintaining a continuity of the outlined collaboration in the face of a change in administration or other operational changes. Information exchange through confidentiality commitments advance FDA's public health mission. It improves FDA's oversight, increases FDA's understanding of complex global supply chains and their effects on the safety and quality of products we regulate, strengthens FDA's capacity to detect and remove violative products and mitigate public health risks through regulatory action. and offer better regulatory guidance in its review activities. This slide focuses on confidentiality commitments as they are the foundation for a lot of FDA's engagement with global counterparts on pharmaceuticals. And as a result of these tools, the FDA is able to exchange critical regulatory information on an ongoing basis with their counterparts in the Americas, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia, as well as with international organizations such as the World Health Organization. These information exchanges enhance FDA's ability to meet its responsibilities of ensuring the safety and effectiveness of the pharmaceuticals it regulates and earning the public's trust. The FDA draws on a range of expertise and information sources in order to produce comprehensive, informed decisions. And as a result of confidentiality commitments, the FDA is able to participate in structured scientific and policy discussions, which we call clusters, with foreign governments. Through clusters, experts from FDA, the European Medicines Agency, the Health Products and Food Branch of Health Canada, Japan, Australia, and others participate in facilitated discussions on such topics as biosimilars, generic drugs, rare disease, pharmacogenomics, advanced therapy, medicinal products, and vaccines. Project Orbis is one example of what we can achieve thanks to confidentiality commitments, which allows FDA to share and receive non-public information with foreign government counterparts and international organizations. This project provides a framework for concurrent submission and review of oncology products with our foreign government counterparts and has led to the approval of numerous oncology drugs for patients across the world. Other examples are the mutual recognition agreements that FDA has with the European Union, the United Kingdom, and most recently with Switzerland. And as a result of underlying confidentiality commitments, the FDA can exchange inspection-related non-public information, which enhances the drug inspection expertise of both parties, resulting in greater efficiencies and providing a more practical means to oversee a large number of drug manufacturing facilities outside of the United States, the EU, the UK, and Switzerland. Before the first MRA went into effect with the EU in 2017, some of the same facilities were being inspected in the same year by EU and FDA investigators, even if the facilities had a strong record of compliance. By sharing each other's inspection reports and related information, the FDA and EU have been able to reallocate resources towards inspection of drug manufacturing facilities with potentially higher public health risks across the globe. A key public health goal for FDA is to strengthen public health supply chains by proactively monitoring, assessing, and communicating risks and vulnerabilities to prevent shortages of pharmaceuticals. Information exchange and collaboration between FDA and various foreign government counterparts and international organizations pertaining to inspections and regulatory actions, including inspection reports, warning letters, and enforcement actions, have better prepared the international regulatory community to triage supply chain disruptions and/or shortage signals, determine potential impacts, and provide public health information to support an informed response. The Office of Trade and Global Partnership, they oversee the development, clearance, and conclusion of international arrangements in consultation with FDA centers and office. We provide policy perspectives on proposed language and negotiations to ensure consistency with FDA law and policy. We also help FDA centers and offices in implementing active international arrangements. And with that, I hope you have a better understanding of the two main types of international arrangements that FDA uses to advance its public health mandate: cooperative arrangements and confidentiality commitments. If you're interested in arrangements FDA has in place, please visit FDA's website that I've projected here. That concludes my presentation. I will be available at the end to answer any questions. Next up is my colleague, Kristen Callahan, who will speak on technical barriers to trade and OTGP's role in addressing non-tariff barriers to trade in pharmaceutical products. Thank you.
Thanks, Azada. My name is Kristen Callahan, and I'm a Senior Public Health Advisor covering trade issues. As Joseph mentioned at the outset, trade policy may not necessarily come to mind when thinking about FDA and our day-to-day work, but the agency is involved in the development of trade policy to ensure that the U.S. trade positions are consistent with the FDA policies, and to use trade agreements as a vehicle for advancing public health priorities. I'll use the next few minutes to describe broad areas covered by our office which impact medical products, including pharmaceutical products. One area we cover involves issues related to technical barriers to trade, or TBT. Broadly speaking, technical barriers to trade are a category of non-tariff barriers to trade. Generally, technical regulations, standard-related measures, and conformity assessment procedures that countries use to regulate markets to protect their consumers or to preserve their natural resources, but they can also be used to discriminate against imports to protect domestic products. U.S. trade obligations seek to ensure that technical regulations and standard-related measures do not create unnecessary barriers to trade. They thus recognize that some regulatory barriers are necessary and that countries that have the right to prepare, adopt, and apply measures necessary to protect human health, safety, and the environment at the levels they consider appropriate and to achieve other legitimate objectives, even if they present barriers to trade. On TBT matters, the vast majority of decision-making takes place with regulators like FDA. For example, FDA regulations related to pharmaceutical products may be considered technical regulations, and we ensure that regulations are no more trade restrictive than necessary. And as another example, through our pharmaceutical inspections, we conduct conformity assessments relying on published FDA requirements on current good manufacturing practices. As Joseph mentioned earlier, in cooperation and coordination with regulatory agencies, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative is responsible for monitoring U.S. compliance with the World Trade Organization and other international obligations related to technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures, and for discussing with foreign governments any TBT-related specific trade concerns on U.S. measures that they have raised. This ongoing interaction concerning trade and regulatory matters ensures U.S. compliance with U.S. trade obligations. Our office, OTGP, represents the FDA as part of the U.S. delegation in trade agreement negotiations and at the WTO committee meetings. So if issues arise related to potential barriers to trade for pharmaceutical products, we ensure that FDA is involved in those discussions and can provide relevant technical expertise. A related role of OTGP is to serve as the agency's lead in trade initiatives or agreement negotiations. These initiatives or agreements may be bilateral or multilateral, and although they are normally between countries, they can also be structured between economies and entities, such as the European Union. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or also known as the USMCA, stands out as one of the most significant agreements in recent years. The USMCA was signed in 2018 and entered into force in 2020. It updated and superseded the 25-year-old North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which was enacted in 1994. One important innovation of the USMCA was to include sector-specific chapters on medical devices and pharmaceuticals that endorsed programs that strive to promote regulatory harmonization or convergence. FDA led those efforts to include these sectoral annexes, and this was a significant improvement not only in U.S. trade policy, but for international public health, as it prioritizes transparent, predictable, and science-based regulatory decision-making. And more recently, our office has been involved in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, also known as IPEF. In May 2022, the United States launched IPEF with 13 other countries, including Australia, Brunei, Fiji, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. One pillar of this initiative is the Supply Chain Resilience Agreement, which will provide tools for IPEF partners to identify supply chain vulnerabilities and to work together to prevent, mitigate, and respond to supply disruptions. This is currently the process that's being implemented. And if drugs and other medical products are identified by our partners as an area of focus, such as a critical sector or a key good, we anticipate more coordination and cooperation in this space in the near future. This brings me to another important dimension of our work, which centers on transparency and good regulatory practices, also known as GRPs. Good regulatory practices are internationally recognized processes and procedures that promote the quality and cost-effectiveness of domestic regulations. In the United States, GRPs are rooted in U.S. law, known as the Administrative Procedures Act, and they are also set forth in trade agreements. GRPs include principles and procedures that address intergovernmental coordination of rulemaking activity, impact assessments, regulatory transparency, stakeholder outreach and engagement, and accountability. Additionally, transparency is an integral part of the WTO or World Trade Organization principles and our commitment as a WTO member. In order to fulfill its commitments related to transparency, the U.S. government has a dedicated interagency process to ensure we meet our commitments. So, how is this relevant to the drug space? One way is that when another country follows the WTO commitments and GRPs, it provides U.S. stakeholders with opportunities to submit comments on proposed technical regulations, such as those applying to drug products, and have their comments taken into account. On a similar note, following good regulatory practices means that regulatory requirements are clearly and transparently communicated to stakeholders, that costs and benefits are considered when regulations are being developed, and that regulations align with relevant international standards. So in other words, good regulatory practices are foundational to the process of developing regulations and providing a voice to stakeholders, and they can thus help regulations to avoid creating the unnecessary barriers to trade I mentioned earlier. So, how is OTGP involved in GRPs and transparency? Our office promotes transparency and GRPs among our partners by supporting the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the U.S. government in trade initiatives and negotiations, as well as direct regulator-to-regulator engagement and capacity building, such as presentations and webinars for industry and regulators. Finally, I'd like to briefly note that our office also monitors trade enforcement actions that may impact drug products. Examples of such action include tariffs imposed on products from foreign countries. For example, under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, and unfair import investigations related to infringement of patents and intellectual property. For example, under Section 337 of the Tariff Act of 1930. These types of actions are under the purview of other agencies, but we at FDA have a clear interest that when they may implicate FDA-regulated products. I'll stop there. That was a quick overview of our trade work, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have during the Q&A portion. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Matt Shearer, who's going to wrap up our presentation by talking about the ongoing United Nations plastics negotiations and the implication it has for pharmaceutical products.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to all of you for devoting a part of your busy schedules to listen to the message we have today. Just for a brief personal introduction, my name is Matthew Shearer. I've been at the FDA for about 17 years. I spent the first 7 years in our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where I worked on developing new gastroenterology drugs. The last 10 years, I've focused on international affairs, and the most recent 2 have been devoted to multilateral engagement, including managing FDA's involvement with the United Nations Plastic Pollution Treaty work. So today I'm going to talk about multilateral negotiations, in particular, FDA's efforts contributing to the development of an international instrument to end plastic pollution. And hopefully at the end of my short talk, you'll have a good feel as to why this should matter to medical products companies. So for a little background, this effort started when the United Nations Environment Assembly issued Resolution 514 on March 2nd, 2022. It requested that an International Negotiating Committee, or INC, be set up to develop an international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic. The intent was to develop the instrument over a series of 5 one-week-long INC meetings taking place approximately every 6 months. The 4th Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting, INC 4, took place in April of this year in Ottawa, Canada. INC 5, the 5th and final planned round, will take place in Busan in the Republic of Korea in November. An instrument is to be ready for members to sign at the end of 2024. The United States government has committed to take a leadership role in the development of this instrument. It seeks to join an agreement that is maximally ambitious, has broad participation among United Nations members, and it wants the instrument to be implementable in the United States under current law and through existing authorities. The State Department heads the delegation, but is supported by many interagency departments and agencies, including the EPA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Department of Defense, and various components of the Department of Health and Human Services, including FDA, as well as several other federal government entities. While the FDA has little direct authority related to plastic waste and pollution, there is a notable overlap in the FDA's remit and the UNEP resolution. Many FDA-regulated products incorporate or are packaged in plastic, which can be integral to such performance characteristics as safety, efficacy, and quality. We at FDA want to make sure that the instrument does not undermine existing FDA regulatory decisions and assessments, it doesn't compromise the availability of important products, and it doesn't undermine consumer confidence in products that fall under our jurisdiction. In addition to what might be called a defensive engagement, we're also looking to assist in making the agreement as ambitious as possible by contributing our regulatory authorities and tools as appropriate, our scientific and research expertise, and by encouraging regulated industry to innovate. The Office of Trade and Global Partnerships leads the U.S. government engagement in this work, which includes extensive coordination with FDA's product centers, collaboration with the U.S. government interagency departments and agencies, and by serving as a part of the United States delegation at the negotiations. Until the 4th round of negotiations in April, the pharmaceutical industry had been fairly quiet in regards to the treaty. But in April, the IFPMA, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Associations, issued a position paper on the global plastic instrument and attended the negotiations. The paper includes support for an ambitious UN global plastics instrument that establishes globally harmonized plastic regulations. This approach is key to securing the scale and effect needed to transition from plastic where possible and to do so safely while ensuring continued access to medicinal products. It also includes a commitment to using the instrument to drive innovation in the industry while keeping focus on providing quality, safe, and effective treatments for patients. The paper emphasizes that plastic materials and components are important in every stage of the pharmaceutical lifestyle and are crucial for production, quality, and safety. Alternative materials are not necessarily always available at this time. The paper further notes the need for targeted extended compliance periods or exceptions for medical and medicinal products when no safe or technically feasible alternative is available, so that access to these products is maintained while the sector transitions to fulfilling the goals of the instrument. In the paper, the IFPMA is emphatic that patient access to medical products should not be disrupted due to any ban on plastic or lack of necessary materials and components. Moreover, it states that advancements in environmental protection in the healthcare sector must go hand in hand with ensuring the highest level of patient safety and access to key medical products. These comments certainly resonate with the FDA. We've been working to ensure that the instrument is crafted in a manner that will not compromise patient access to critical, safe, and effective medical products. So as you can see from this table, the draft text is organized around the life cycle of plastic. Upstream refers to production and consumption of primary plastic inputs such as raw polymers and additives. The product or midstream category refers to design and manufacture of products containing plastic, while the downstream area refers to preventing and managing and mitigating waste. So just to be clear, this is a list of example provisions. It is not an outline of the U.S. position going into negotiations. While there are many perspectives on every step of the life cycle, the upstream provisions are especially contentious. One group of countries opposes any upstream measures whatsoever, but another group, a very large coalition of countries, supports strict production limits and a ban on the use of certain substances in plastic. This slide summarizes the key milestones of the negotiations. Some of my personal observations from recent INC meetings are that health ministries and regulatory agencies have been scant in attendance at these meetings, which is a bit surprising considering the potential impact of the instrument on food and medical products. The national delegations are typically led by a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or a Ministry of Environment, and some of the positions they support suggest that they're not consulting adequately with their food and medical products regulators. The United States, as well as some other delegations, have suggested exclusions or exemptions that cover medical products. But given that the instrument's provisions are still under negotiation, it remains to be seen whether these will be necessary. Thank you so much for your attention to this very quick overview of what's a fairly dense topic. This concludes the FDA presentations for the day, but we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to our presenters for their excellent presentations. We will now begin our question and answer panel. If you haven't had a chance to enter your question into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. And now we'll see some questions coming in. We'll start with a question that is in for Mr. Joseph Rieras. We have someone who is interested to learn how the Office of Trade and Global Partnerships plays a part in the Office of Global Policy and Strategy, or OGPS, and especially how it plays a part with strengthening regulatory systems and partnership in low and middle income countries. Can you comment on that?
Thank you for the question. That's a very good question, as it reflects a priority area for our office, which is regulatory system strengthening. So I can address this question in two fronts. The first is that we are engaged with the World Health Organization on to promote regulatory system strengthening. For instance, through the Pan American Health Organization, which is the regional form of the WHO, we support regulatory system strengthening in Latin America to foster implementation of best practices for medical products, and to encourage regulators in the region to engage in initiatives on regulatory harmonization and convergence, such as the ICH. And concerning WHO, we support global efforts to prevent, detect, and respond to substandard and falsified medicines from a public health perspective through our work with the WHO member state mechanism on substandard and falsified medical products. This forum produces tools, training, data, and guidance to assist regulatory authorities in combating counterfeits. We also encourage the WHO to utilize and implement the outputs of relevant international initiatives such as the ICH. Now, secondly, we are engaged directly with national regulatory authorities and LMICs, and also relevant regional organizations. In particular, I want to highlight that we support regulatory strengthening in Africa. Recently, we signed a statement of cooperation with PPB, our counterpart in Kenya, and we have bilateral engagements and dialogues with other partners in Africa. Generally, we are supporting the African Medicines Agency as it becomes operational. We participate in several of the harmonization technical committees that will underpin the AMA. The AMA, when fully operational, will support system strengthening in the region. Now, we recognize that authorities from LMICs must contribute to global convergence and harmonization efforts, including advancing good regulatory practices. Our goal is to encourage active participation from African regulators in these initiatives while building support for the African Medicines Agency. And I hope that addresses your question. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much for all that information provided. Now we'll move on to a question for Ms. Azada Hafiz. The question is, how is a need for new confidentiality commitments with prospective foreign counterparts identified?
Thank you. That's a great question. The impetus for new confidentiality commitments can come from FDA staff or from a foreign counterpart. The FDA goes through an internal assessment where we weigh legal and policy considerations. And ultimately, the decision to pursue a confidentiality commitment is based on mutual needs, benefits, and a consideration of FDA's resources. And so just some, general scenarios that could prompt a confidentiality commitment. It could be in response to a reorganization. If there's a new division that's been added to a foreign counterparts agency, that could initiate a new confidentiality commitment. Or if there's a change in regulatory responsibilities of the agency, that could also prompt a new confidentiality commitment. Another reason often is if we establish a new cooperative arrangement or a memorandum of understanding with the counterpart, and we need to engage in information sharing activities, then that would be another good reason to do a confidentiality commitment. If there's a new counterpart that we're interested in working with, someone that we expect to share information with in the future, or we would like to collaborate with more, then that's another reason. I did mention policy considerations, and policy considerations include, making a determination of whether FDA needs the information, if the information that the foreign counterpart seeks could be released through other means, such as through FOIA. So just, really making a determination if a confidentiality commitment is really needed. And then also weighing things like the likely risk of sharing the information for FDA, because when we're sharing non-public information, it's really important that the counterpart who would receive it has the means to protect the information. And then on the legal side, we have some legal requisites that we have to consider. So a counterpart must be a foreign government agency. They must perform at least one FDA counterpart function. such as product application review, compliance review, standard setting, regulatory research, etc. So those are some of the things we think about when we're considering establishing a new confidentiality commitment. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for that response. Now we'll move on to a question that is for Ms. Eloisa Noriega. Um, does the FDA recognize inspections by capable authorities regardless of the location, for example, outside of the EU?
Thank you so much for your question. So the MRA provides the FDA and our MRA partners the option to rely on inspection reports issued by the authority of outside of our respective territories. And as of July 2024, FDA has formally completed assessments for our MRA partners regulators to accept inspection reports from inspections conducted outside of, well, in this case, the EU and the UK, with the exception of Switzerland, which has a pending assessment for inspections outside of Switzerland. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you for that information as well. Another question for you, while we have you here, is the FDA planning on entering into any more mutual recognition agreements?
Thank you for that question. So, to assess potential new regulatory partners, FDA considers its existing regulatory relationship with the regulator and the maturity of their regulatory framework, along with the cost benefit of developing, assessing, implementing, and maintaining an agreement compared to the size of the industry, among other factors. And at this time, FDA has considered whether it should enter into mutual recognition agreements with additional regulators, but has not yet begun the process with additional candidates. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that information as well. Now we have a question for Ms. Kristen Callahan. How does the office evaluate potential impact of EU policies on trade? What is the process to flag draft statutes for discussion with EU partners?
That's a great question. I say, first of all, generally speaking, we work with our trade agencies like the US Trade Representative and the Department of Commerce when there are related policies related to FDA's commodity areas that could impact trade. So an example is the discussions that are happening either on the floor of the World Trade Organization, the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, or maybe they are bilateral discussions on the sidelines of the committee meetings. Separately, we also work with FDA's foreign offices. So for instance, related to this question, we would work with our Europe office to have technical discussions with their counterparts to understand a proposed measure or statute. There are different tools in our toolbox. That's really the point of this, and that we're hoping to get across this presentation is the ways that we engage with not only our other regulators, but how we like to hear from companies and parties that are affected by potential measures. If there's ever a need to flag for FDA a draft measure or statute, you can always reach out to our office to discuss. So please remember to keep Office of Trade and Global Partnerships on top of your mind. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Another question for you, Ms. Callahan. How do trade agreements or initiatives affect the process of importing/exporting pharmaceutical products?
That's also another great question. I think one way to consider that is there's an aspect to a lot of these trade agreements and initiatives that we do work on. There's a specific topic that is that's led by the U.S. Trade Representative, but FDA does closely monitor, and that's related to the customs and trade facilitation chapters of these trade agreements and initiatives. Really what that chapter does is, there's already in place an agreement at the World Trade Organization called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, also known as TFA. And when we have these bilateral agreements or discussions, what we're trying to do is see what the baseline commitments are of this World Trade Organization agreement and ways that we can build upon that and ease the burdens where possible for importers, as well as ways to better expedite products that are needed across the border, such as pharmaceutical products. Another idea or way that we engage is when we engage bilaterally, whether it's through a trade discussion that's already happening or one with another regulator, to share information about FDA's processes. So, for instance, to share information about our certificate on pharmaceutical products, the CPPs. As sometimes other regulators may not be familiar with the information that's included on a CPP, how FDA came about to issuing a CPP, and other aspects that FDA considers. So that's a great question. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you again for your response. And now we'll go to a question that came in for Ms. Eloisa Noriega. Does your information apply to medical devices?
Thank you again for that question. So the FDA's current MRAs only apply to human and animal drug products. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for confirming that as well. Another question for you. Does the FDA leverage the MRA with EU member states for pre-approval inspections?
Happy to answer that for you. The sharing and use of application-based inspections will occur only after FDA and our MRA's partners review and have a thorough understanding of each other's pre-approval and post-approval inspections. So I think currently the answer is not at this time.
Okay, thank you. And one more MRA question for you. When were animal products added to the MRA?
Sure, happy to answer that as well. So for the EU, the scope of the MRA was expanded to include animal drugs on May 31st of 2023. And for the UK, the scope of the MRA was expanded on September 27th, 2021. And for the Swiss MRA, animal drugs were included in the MRA scope since it was entered into force last year. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your response. Now we have a question that came in for Azada Hafiz. How does the OTGP/FDA exchange proprietary data and information? Is confidential information being shared securely via an IT platform, or is it being done via email and/or SharePoint? What type of information is being exchanged?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yes. So I would say for counterparts whom we exchange information perhaps the most routinely with, for example, the EMA and EU member states, we have a platform called UserLink, and that's what is used or should be used to exchange non-public information. For other counterparts who we also exchange information with on a pretty routine basis, such as Health Canada, the emails between our systems are encrypted. And actually, that's also true for EU member states as well. One thing to note is that when we negotiate new confidentiality commitments, we often do it in collaboration with FDA's Office of Information System. So we do a good sort of check ahead of time to make sure that, to the best of our abilities, we have some, confidence that the counterpart has secure information systems in place. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that response as well. Now we'll move on to a question about that's directed for Ms. Kristen Callahan here. Is the FDA monitoring the EU's chemical strategy and pharmaceutical reforms as potential technical barriers to trade? For example, 10,000 plus PFAS restrictions, environmental practices in scope of GMP inspections, or ability to refuse marketing applications based on incomplete environmental risk assessments?
Thanks for that question. I think that really relates right on point to the work that we do, working with the U.S. Trade Representative, who is the lead for representing the U.S. government in the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. We do monitor that measure along with other measures that are being proposed by the EU and obviously other World Trade Organization members who have notified measures to the TBT committee. And so with that, we'll work with our trade agencies to ensure that the comments that the US government submits, whether it's by having a conversation, in other words, a bilateral with the EU, or if it's something on the floor, that it represents the concerns of FDA as a regulator. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much for that response. And it looks like all the questions we have time for. Thank you again to our presenters for all the excellent information that's been shared today.